Before we get started, I want to make sure we're clear on the context of this video. The context is a response to the argument from evil that argues that the existence of God is inconsistent, logically inconsistent with the presence of evil. That if God exists, there should be no evil, but is evil, so God does not exist. And we're looking at a free will defense, which is the most common way to mount a defense against that argument from evil. And I'm looking at one from Bernstein and Helms. And just a little bit more background on this. Now, this is from Bernstein and Helms themselves. They say, for decades, Alvin Plantinga's response to J.L. Mackey's argument from evil with Plantinga's free will defense was considered a successful refutation of Mackey's argument. So that occurred in the late 60s, 1960s, and Plantinga developed his free will defense more thoroughly in the 1970s. And Keith DeRose, one example of a philosopher who said it was about as decisive as philosophical victories get. And that seems to have been the consensus of the day. So the Bernstein and Helms think that there is success already with Plantinga. They do not claim that Plantinga's response fails, right? But what they do is they consider a much simpler response. Now, to go on and fill in the gaps here a little bit, even though DeRose and others have considered it a decisive victory, there are still certainly proponents of that logical argument from evil, and there are still detractors of the free will defense. And so it makes sense that they would go on to clarify a possible response, even if they think Plantinga's defense succeeds. Now, what they need to do, their response, is to make two assumptions. So they are going to assume that libertarianism, including the principle of alternative possibilities, is possibly true. And so if you don't know what we're talking about there with libertarianism and principle of alternative possibilities, you may want to review some videos on what free will is. They also assume that God's existence is consistent with significantly free agents who never go wrong. Now, this assumption, it may seem odd. I mean, this is the kind of thing that Mackey claimed is possible. So just as a point of clarification here, for libertarianism, again, we are making this clear. It's the conjunction of two claims: incompatibilism, the idea that causal determinism is incompatible with free will. So libertarianism affirms that claim of incompatibilism. And it also says that some people sometimes act freely. So it doesn't mean that everybody always acts freely. There's certainly cases where people lack free will. Libertarians would agree with that, but that sometimes they do act freely. And just to clarify a little bit further, that means that they have alternatives when they are acting. Okay, so what's the task at hand? The task is to show that there are two propositions that are, in fact, consistent. So this is what the proponent of the argument from evil denies, at least the logical version. And the two propositions are that God exists, so we'll keep that in mind. That's number 3. And there is evil in the world. So 3 and 4 are inconsistent, say people like J.L. Mackey and others who are proponents of the logical argument from evil. And then they say you have to fill in the gaps, of course, on how to demonstrate that that's the case. But the free will defense is trying to show that these two claims are, in fact, consistent. Now, when we say that God exists, we're talking about God with the traditional attributes, all the omni attributes, so all-powerful, all-knowing, and those are the two big ones, and omnibenevolent, the third. Okay. And there's evil in the world. Evil here doesn't have to be understood like we often use it in normal language, but just suffering of some kind, a bad state of affairs. Somebody having a toothache even could be considered evil. Right? A quick review of Plantinga's strategy when he responds to the argument from evil and how he demonstrates or attempts to demonstrate, if you choose, to show that 3 and 4 are consistent. So what he did, he identified a proposition, a third proposition then, that is consistent with 3, so it'd be consistent with the idea that God exists, and entails 4, entails actually that evil exists. And that does seem to be the best strategy to show that 2 propositions are consistent. Just generically, if you have 2 propositions and you want to prove that they are in fact consistent, you just construct a model. You have a proposition that's consistent with one and entails the other. And that third proposition that is consistent with the one and entails the other doesn't have to be true, right? It doesn't even have to be plausible. It merely has to be possible. And if it's possible and it's consistent with 3 and it entails 4, well, that shows that 3 and 4 are consistent. Now, just a little example outside the context of the issue of evil and God, A and B seem to be consistent. So let's say Joe's a fry cook at McDonald's, and the only source of Joe's income is his job at McDonald's. Now, if you heard somebody say this, they were talking about their friend Joe, and then they also say later, Joe's a billionaire, you're going to assume that they're talking about somebody else, probably, because those two things don't go together. That does not make sense that Joe would be a billionaire and a fry cook at McDonald's. However, they are not inconsistent. So just consider a third proposition that's consistent with A and entails B. And we could imagine this. Joe inherited billions of dollars last year that he keeps in cash in a very large safe. So he had no income off that money. So he continues to work as a fry cook because, of course, he loves it so much. And that is consistent with A, and it entails B. And so this shows that A and B, despite initial appearances, are in fact consistent claims. So B&H have a similar strategy, right? They use the same technique that they want to show that God exists and the proposition that there is evil in the world, that those two propositions are consistent. Now, their advantage, they claim, an advantage, besides their presentation being simpler, is that they don't assume some of the more controversial aspects of Plantinga's defense. Now, Plantinga developed the idea of transworld depravity, so a lot of people have issues with that. It's complicated. And he also, when people said, well, what about natural evil? He said, well, it's possible that you have free agents who are causing natural evil, and a lot of people don't like that, but that isn't really a criticism of his presentation, but it just sounds odd. Okay, so they want to take on that strategy, and they're going to use this principle, AP. And this means a person P performs some action A at some time T freely, only if it's possible for P to have freely refrained from performing A at T. Now, if you're familiar with the free will literature, a libertarian might say that what AP means, this principle means, is that in order to act freely, you have to have the ability to do otherwise, right? If you do A freely, then you could have done otherwise, right? You have alternative possibilities is the idea. And maybe that's what the AP stands for, alternative possibilities. Now, let's make sure we're clear what AP involves. So I have the page reference, never mind that for now. it means there is an agent who may act freely, then this involves the following claims. So they give an example here. Let's say John. John's an agent who can act freely, and he must decide to perform A or not A, where A is any given action for which John is free. Now, there's a possible state of affairs. That's what the SOA stands for, state of affairs. There's a possible situation, a state of affairs S, that obtains in W, some world, W, that has three characteristics that includes John's being faced with the decision to perform A or not A at T, maybe to go to a concert or not go to a concert. So John's has this possibility in front of him. It does not include John's deciding to perform A at T. So there's not a decision yet in this state of affairs S. And includes John being free with respect to A, and we have free including the alternative possibilities. Okay. Now, suppose John freely performs A at some time T2 in W, in a world. So that's what John does in W. He goes to the concert, for example. Now, what that means, though, is that there is another possible world, call it W star, that includes the same state of affairs S. It's identical with world W up to T1, but rather in W star, the difference is John does not A at T2. So John does not go to the concert at T2 in this other world. That's what it means for John to be free. Now they introduce this idea of saintly agents. Saintly agents are ones who are significantly free. They have alternative possibilities. They can act in the way that John acted, for example, go to the concert, but have another world in which they, possible world in which they don't go to the concert. But saintly agents, of course, are significantly free and never go wrong with respect to any of their actions. So they have both of those characteristics. They never make a mistake. They don't make they aren't morally flawed. They are saintly. Okay, now we've set up the background enough to move on to the key proposition then that is consistent with 3. Recall, 3, God exists, and entails 4, that there is evil in the world. So what is that proposition? Well, it's very simple. It's the idea that saintly agents exist. Okay? Now, all this has to be is possibly true. Keep in mind. It's not a claim that, in fact, it's true. It's just a proposition that we are considering in order to see whether or not 3 and 4 might be consistent. Now, 6 is consistent with 3. So it's possible that God creates a world with saintly agents. Now, Mackey certainly wouldn't have any problems with that. He claims that that's what God should have done for all people. Everyone should have been a saintly agent. So that doesn't seem to be objectionable here, and it is consistent with 3. And given our understanding of what freedom involves, given AP, that there are alternatives, 6, the idea that saintly agents exist, entails 4. It actually entails that there is evil that exists. Now, Bernstein and Helms want you to note that it's not possible for God to create this kind of world with all saintly agents on his own. God can't do it on his own because it requires the free actions of agents to be saintly. Now, Mackey argued that God can create a world with saintly agents, so it's not controversial. Again, he argued that you could create an entire world full of only saintly agents. But it's 6 entails 4, right? So let's be clear about why that is. Some implications here. So suppose God actualizes a world W, and it includes saintly agents, and we can say that it only includes saintly agents so that there is no moral evil, at least in W. Now consider Eve, and Eve is a saintly agent, okay? So an action A of keeping a promise to God is what we're going to consider. So we have Eve and some action of possibly keeping a promise to God. Now, since she's a saintly agent, we know that there's some state of affairs, S, in W that includes Eve being faced with a decision at T1. If she's a saintly agent, she's a free agent. And so she has this decision to perform A or not A, to keep the promise or to fail to keep the promise. It doesn't include Eve's deciding to perform A, right? The state of affairs is prior to her decision. But it does include A in being such that should Eve decide not to perform A, she will go wrong and will have disobeyed God. So you let it play out. Since Eve is a saintly agent, she's not going to go wrong with respect to A, so she will decide to do A and do A. But should she decide not to, because she's a free agent and she could, she will go wrong and disobey God. And this, of course, includes Eve being free with respect to A. Now let's continue this implication here. Let's continue thinking this through. So Eve performs A at T3. Now, by principle AP, that means there's some other world, W star. So if she had an alternative possibility, so there exists another world with Eve in W star that includes that state of affairs S, right? Setting up the prior to a decision whether or not to do A or not A. It is identical to W, where, of course, Eve makes the right choice. She fulfills the promise in every way prior to T2. So it's entirely identical up to point T2, that time. But then it includes Eve's decision to perform not A at T2. So Eve decides in this world W star to not fulfill A. It also then, of course, includes Eve's failure to perform A at T3. So that world W star, Eve fails to fulfill her promise. Now, in W star, God exists, right? It's identical to W in every way prior to T2. So, of course, God exists there. And Eve goes wrong. And so Eve does a moral wrong in W star. And that means that W star includes evil. So the conjunction of 3 and 6, God exists is 3, 6 is our the existence of our saintly agent. That entails that 3 and 4 are consistent. And we're, of course, background assumption, we're assuming that to act freely includes alternative possibilities. Now, that's the kind of the solution, right? This is we've got to the point. Now, Bernstein and Helms, they go on to argue that they don't even need to assume incompatibilism, which they did, right, when they assumed libertarianism, because incompatibilism is part of them. But they do say they need to assume that free will is compatible with indeterminism. Now, some compatibilists will accept that, some compatibilists might reject that, but they do have to make that assumption that free will is compatible with indeterminism. So, and then that's what they do with their libertarianism, of course, because they assume that determinism is false, so that there are alternative possibilities, and that's what is included with people act freely. So we have just a simpler free will defense because all they're doing is saying, hey, it's possible saintly agents exist. We'll assume libertarianism. And you have saintly agents. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means there's some world in which God exists, and there is this person who is a saintly agent in W, but in W star, they fail morally. And so in W star, you have God existing and evil existing. So the two claims, 3 and 4, are consistent.